All right, it is starting to set us up, and then it'll just take me about 15 seconds or so to stop the echo. All right, everyone. I know that we are live and so excited to see everyone. Okay, and there we go. Hey, everyone, this is Jo Massaro, and I am so excited today because I am talking to someone who I have been looking to talk to for quite a while. I have read her book that's out. As you can see, the Mulberry Leaf Whispers behind me. But there's a one before that that I have just ordered that I'm going to be reading as well. This is Linda Thompson, and I'm just going to read a short little bio, but I just want to say welcome and thank you so much for being with me.
Thank you so much, Jo. It's just great to be here. And it's just great to hear what the Lord's doing in your life and in your life of ministry. So we've been having a nice little chat, and I'm sort of looking forward to extending that enjoyable chat to your listeners.
Oh, wonderful. And so I'm, again, Jo Massaro with Jo Massaro Ministries, and we are live on my book club Facebook page, which is Yahweh Sisterhood Book Club. So welcome, everybody. And I'm going to read Linda's bio, and then we're going to jump right in because there is so much to talk about. And I love this bio, by the way. I always say when I grow up, I want to write like someone, and I want to write like you. So,
Oh,
so let me just read it. It says, once upon a time, a top engineering school graduate, a nationally ranked ice dancer, and a perpetual batterer at glass ceilings, Linda stepped back from a high-tech career that spanned continents to pursue her true passion, engineering words that embolden souls. Her first two novels have garnered an Independent Publishers Book Award, plus 2 Cascade Awards, and have filled Christie and Carol Awards finalist slots. That is something right there, I got to tell you. And you'll know why when you read the book. Linda is a thirsty recipient of God's extravagant grace and an expectant denizen of the fig tree generation. And this is Luke 21:28. Now, when these things begin to happen, look up and lift up your heads. She and her husband, a third-generation airline pilot who doubles as her chief military research officer, are currently working on reinventing themselves as heartland homesteaders in their new home in Prescott, Arizona. Wow. I have questions just on that bio.
there's a lot packed in there. You know, it's my new bio, so I'm just listening to you read it and go, maybe I tried to pack too much into those little
I don't
words.
know. I think it's really wonderful. And people can contact you right now on Substack, which is lindathompson.substack.com, and we'll post that out there for everyone. So tell us a little bit about, I mean, we've learned a little bit by these words that you've written, but tell us a little bit about yourself and maybe a little bit about your writing journey.
Well, we were talking before we launched here about, and my writing journey is actually somewhat similar to yours.
Oh.
I've always been a little confused about whether I'm a right brain or a left brain person. And I made my living from my left brain for decades and I did this engineering thing, and then I worked in technical marketing and worked in high technology. And somewhere around the age of 50, my right brain kind of rebelled and said, hey, can we do something in the creative space, please? Mm. So it was about that time that my husband came to me. He's like my bio says, he's a third-generation pilot, and he's very interested in military history and aviation history. So he was reading a book about World War II. It was a World War II history book. Mm-hmm. And he walked up to me one day, kind of out of the blue, with this book open about 2/3 into it. And he thrusted at me and he said, you need to read this story right here. Mm-hmm. And it was, maybe 3 or 4 pages out of this secular history book, but it was just this amazing faith story about how, God had really reached in and turned a life around in the most desperate situation you can imagine, and just all the fruit that came from that. And I'm like, wow, that's an amazing story. And then my husband said to me, someone should write a book about that.
Someone.
So I didn't really have a huge aspiration that I was going to be a novelist someday when I grew up, like many writers do. But the story basically called to me. The story said, someone needs to tell this, to bring this story to a wider and different audience. And after a lot of prayer and soul searching and a lot of fleeces and a lot of waiting for doors to open or close, I wound up concluding that that someone actually was me. So that was the first novel, The Plum Blooms in Winter. And I was, honestly, Joe, if I'd had any idea what was actually involved in writing a novel, I think I would have been afraid to start. I thought, well, I'll just, type away for a couple of years, then I'll have this novel and then I'll, take it to the world and there will be acclaim. I thought that was how it worked, but there's a whole lot of blood, sweat, and tears. And I actually was 7 years writing that first novel, and rewrote it 2.5 times. And then got a publisher and got into the editing process with the publisher. It's like, oh my gosh, am I ever going to be done editing this book? But then the Mulberry Leaf Whispers is a very much related story. In fact, originally they were going to be one book and it was just too much for one book. So it wound up being 2 books. But once the first story was told, the second story sort of called and begged to be told the same way the first story had.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I have learned, because as we have talked, this was not a journey that I thought I would be on. And it is not for the faint of heart. I will say that. It is not. I mean, just in research alone, there is so much. And I say, when is enough? And, and there's just so many things that you're trying to learn along the way. But I have to say this, and I always say this about authors and writers and people that I've met along the way, that they are the most generous people. And they have given so much of their time and their knowledge, and they're not afraid to say, how can I help? Or, I think maybe this should be a little different. Or, what do you think about this? And I just have found that they are some of the most wonderful people that I have met in my lifetime.
Right. I agree.
Yeah. So let's go back to research, because this had to be something that you obviously, when you read the book, you realize there's so much research that had to have gone into this. So maybe you could share a little bit about that journey.
Well, that's true. And of course, when you start out, you don't realize how much you don't know. And my protagonist, actually, between the 2 books, I have 4 different point of view characters, 2 point of view characters in each book, and 3 out of the 4 are Japanese. And it really is a very different worldview, at least historically. Maybe that's less true today, but historically, it's a very different worldview than ours. And really being able to tell that in what I believe is an authentic way, that's part of why it took 7 years, I'm sure, because it just wasn't fully baked probably the first couple times. But I was really blessed to have a great contact. Actually, he was one of my business clients, was a Japanese man. One of my consulting clients was a Japanese company. And he was very generous about answering my questions and, sharing how he saw the world. And another real resource I had for the World War II sections, which was kind of fun. And you don't always have this for historical fiction at all, but there's a wealth of movies, that were made by Japanese directors for a Japanese audience at that time. And, so part of my story revolves around, kind of the criminal element in World War II Japan, and the story goes some pretty dark places. But that was sort of a genre that was out there in Japanese movies at the time. Well, it was sort of film noir, so there were the gangster movies and, the prostitutes and so on. And so I was able to just watch all these Japanese movies and really get a sense for what the period looked like. How did people interact? How did they treat each other? What were the details of life? And the first time I tried to watch one of those movies, and they're all subtitled, right? So
Yeah.
the first time I tried to watch one of those movies, literally I had no idea what was going on most of the time because it was just so foreign. But over time, I came to realize, oh, they're playing a card game, and so those details. Oh, she's warming the baby bottle over a coal brazier because that's how they're heating the room. And so over time, those kind of details worked their way into the novel and gave it a lot more color. And honestly, I, like you, I've always been interested in history. Not so much, dates but how people actually lived has always, what did it feel like to be this person walking in these shoes in that era?
And it's pretty fascinating because you go from like the war, World War II, and then you go way back in time. And it's just fascinating how each, you just jockey each of those in there and they just blend so beautifully together. So
And Jill, I will tell you, that's where the Lord showed up in both of the books. The way that the stories, because both books are time slips to some degree. The first book, both of the timelines are World War II, so they're the same era, but they're separated by a few years. But in the second book, they're separated like by 350 years.
Yeah.
But in both books, the Lord really showed up when it was time to merge the two stories. And, there were patterns when I went to weave the two stories together. There were patterns I'd never seen, that just emerged. And especially with the second book, I write, from what I understand, other authors I've talked to that do dual time fiction write both the stories together, but I don't. I write them separately. It works better for me that way because I'm able to immerse myself more in each story. But the second story, I'm writing away, and I'm like, Lord, and this is Mulberry. I'm like, Lord, I don't actually know what's going to tie these two stories together. And when I get about 2/3 of the way through and I still don't know what's going to tie these two stories together. I mean, obviously there were some common themes, but I'm getting a little bit desperate because I'm on deadline and I'm 2/3 done and I still don't know how the stories are going to tie together. But the Lord showed up. The Lord was faithful.
He sure did.
Yeah.
It's beautiful. And when you're talking about movies and shows, I think I read in there, you had talked about Shogun. Now, I actually have the DVDs of Shogun. There's a little story about that. I was, as a returning adult student, and it was on TV, and I was studying for my final exams. And then you couldn't record. Okay, so I'm kind of dating myself. So I so wanted to see it and never was able to. And I loved Richard Chamberlain as well. And so I'm going to go back now. I haven't had time.
He was a hottie back in the day, wasn't he?
Oh yes. I'm going to go back and watch that all over again. So I'm real excited about doing that. So
well, we watched it. I remember watching it as a teenager. And we didn't watch tons of TV, but for some reason we chose to watch that one. It was what do they call those? A docudrama or whatever. It went on for several nights. I mean, it's not like a 2-hour movie. It's
right.
But I think that, some level of fascination with Japanese culture maybe was born way back then in high school when I was watching Shogun.
Well, it's interesting because when I was reading this book, I thought this would make a great, not necessarily a movie because there would be so much in it, but I thought what a great series this would be. So I'm hoping that somebody, that God would move, if that's his will, that, because I just loved it so much. And you have just written such a beautiful story.
Oh, thank you.
So I'm hoping that happens. One day I'm hoping I'll get an email or a call from you and you'll say, guess what?
Well, part of my, and then, so I was a teenager when I first got interested probably in Japanese culture. And then I did some business in Japan as a younger woman. And I traveled a great deal in my career. And that was really what I enjoyed the most, really, was getting to go different places and meet different people and learn about their cultures and share, God's good news with them to the degree that I was able to. And it got to the point where Europe didn't really feel foreign to me. I don't speak the language, but culturally we have a lot in common. And once you learn a few phrases, you can make out what's happening. But then I went to Japan and to Asia generally, and there you're foreign. You can't even read the signs.
Wow.
You as a kind of average height American woman at that time, at least, I towered over most of the men in Japan.
Wow.
I was like this Amazon woman, you know, this blonde head that was moving above the crowd, and
It's too
and you
funny.
don't understand the culture, and the food is unfamiliar,
Yes,
and it's a whole different experience, which
that's pretty funny, but it's so true. I can imagine you walking through the streets right now, and you would look like a blonde Amazon woman walking around. So let me ask you, what's the significance of the title and what's really the premise of the book? If you could maybe just share a little bit about that.
well, the Plum Blooms in Winter, the title, I stole that title. It's beautiful and unfamiliar to an English speaking audience, but I stole that from a very common Japanese saying.
Okay.
And obviously I can only really paraphrase, but the 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 Japanese are keen observers of nature,
Mhm.
and many of their festivals revolve around the natural, the cherry blossom festival in the spring, and moon gazing, and the autumn leaves. And there are festivals around all of these things. And where for us, flowers are kind of girly in our culture, they're not in Japanese culture. Samurai families, their crests would be flowers. And flowers have different characteristics that are just sort of culturally understood. So the plum blooms in winter, the Japanese proverb it came from, two poets are talking and they're arguing about which is the most beautiful flower. And poet number one says, oh, clearly it's the cherry blossom. The cherry blossom is the most ephemeral and beautiful and elegant flower. And the other poet says, well, plums are not as showy. But once you've seen the hardiness of the plum and the way a plum blooms right through the snow, then you've seen true beauty,
Oh, wow.
and the cherry blossom will lose its appeal. And the poet said it a lot better. I'm like I say, I'm
I know, it
paraphrasing,
sounded pretty good to me.
but that to me was really both of my point of view characters in the first novel endured incredible hardship and found their spiritual foundations through that hardship, and were refined by that hardship and bloomed. And so to me, the plum blooms in winter just really epitomized both of my characters. So
Beautiful.
then the mulberry leaf whispers, since it's the next in the series, I kind of made that up. It's not from a Japanese proverb, that's my own, but it does show up. The mulberry shows up as a sort of a motif throughout the book.
Mhm.
And the point of the mulberry is that it's not a thing of beauty. You would not plant a mulberry tree to ornament your garden. You
Mhm.
plant a mulberry tree because it's useful. It gives its leaves to the silkworm, and then you can wind up with these wonderful elegant garments. So the mulberry, where the cherry lives to show off, but it's a very brief life. The mulberry is a workhorse and it lives to serve. And
Wow.
so that's kind of its image throughout the novel is
Is
in the well, really both families depicted in the novel are in the upper echelon of Japanese society, but the challenge is for the Christian young woman to direct the rest of her family into this life of service. Yes, you're a warlord, but you're supposed to be serving the people who depend on you.
yes, absolutely. So is the main characters in your book, if you could maybe share a little bit about that, and then is there a character, one or two, that you feel you might identify with?
So all of my point of view characters are inspired by real people. They're all fictional characters, but they're all inspired by real people and follow real stories. Sono in the second book was inspired by a real samurai lady, the daughter of probably the most famous Christian samurai, which a lot of people don't even know that Christian samurai were a thing, but
I did not
they're
until I read the story.
um, I think whenever you write, and Joe, tell me what you think, but I think your characters always reflect some part of you, because how would you write them authentically if they don't? And sometimes they represent maybe your worst facets, and sometimes they represent maybe who you are more aspirationally.
Yeah, I so agree. And I'm writing, a middle grade series. So, for me, I've had to put myself in the shoes of a 12-year-old boy
Wow.
and his dog, his British bulldog named Winston. And so it is really, and there's time travel involved. And so it's pretty fascinating. But I think I have discovered some things about myself along the way as well. And
Well, and that's
interestingly enough,
actually something I really wanted to share. So my first book, The Plum Blooms in Winter, the Lord I shared the story about how the Lord directed me to write this book. And so there are two characters who are both really in horrendous situations. There's an American who is a prisoner of war, a prisoner of the Japanese.
oops, I just lost you. I think you're muted. There we
That's
go.
about as bad as it gets in terms of what they endured, the starvation and the torture. And but the character that the Lord used to reveal some things to me about myself was the female character, Miyako. So she's a young lady who went through, well, let's just say the war was not kind to Japanese civilians toward the end. And
Yeah.
so she went through seeing whole neighborhoods decimated by the firebombing and, losing family, having her father sickened, to the point where he was in basically an invalid, and having to care for him in a situation where people really were starving. They really had been bombed back to the Stone Age. That became a saying in a different war, but that's really what happened to the Japanese at the end of the war. So she had gone through all that trauma, and then she was sexually trafficked, which was unfortunately not an uncommon experience for young women in that era,
Sure.
in that time and place. And so I'm trying to kind of wrap my head around, how does it feel to have gone through that level of sexual trauma, trauma in general, but sexual trauma especially. And I picked up really a very helpful book that was written about sort of healing sexual trauma. And I'm reading through this book and I'm thinking to myself, okay, I understand this is how my character would respond to life. Why do I feel like I respond so much the same way? And so what the Lord had directed me into, unbeknownst to me, wound up being a very big healing experience. Because, and I it's not like I'd been horribly abused, but there were a lot of memories from my childhood that I had repressed. And these started coming out as I was working on writing Miyako, and then seeing the commonality between my character and myself. And what I learned through all of that is that I had been sexually abused as a girl as well. And it wasn't like this horrible, I was raped, I was, whatever, but what the term we would use today is I was sexualized. As a very young child, I was sexualized, but I had repressed all of that. And those hidden memories were governing my behavior in ways I never understood. I never understood why I acted certain ways. And especially before I was a Christian, I never understood why I had such a compulsion always to have a boyfriend. And so the Lord, as I'm working on this book, I'm thinking I'm doing this as a ministry for others, but the Lord is really using it to kind of peel back the onion on my own experience and show me things about myself I never knew. And of course, once things are brought to the light, there can finally be healing. Yes. As opposed to when things are repressed, they just fester. So it was the cathartic experience for me, honestly.
I just love what God does. I can relate to some of those things in my life. And I just know that in my culture, I'm an Italian, and in my day, you don't talk about things, you don't deal with things, and that is how I grew up, and that's how you deal with things. And then God just began to show me over the years that I was really not living a life that I really should have been living. And that I've often said this when I speak, that, I got very good at wearing masks.
Right.
And you wear them for this situation, for that person. And we're so good at, walking into church and saying, oh, how are you? And say, oh, we're fine, and lots of times we're not. And so just to be able to be vulnerable and honest, and honest with myself, first of all, as to what's really going on, and then allowing God to do all those, that surgeon work, that, that great physician that we need to have. And it takes sometimes a long time to get to the point where, because it's not always it's fun, and it's not always easy, and it's like, I don't want to do this, but God has a plan, and I'm so grateful. So thank you for sharing that. I really appreciate that.
And when you go through that kind of experience, one of the things that you learn to do is to separate yourself from your feelings.
Mhm.
So a lot of times I didn't even know what I felt. I was acting based on some feeling that I didn't even actually feel. If that makes any sense at
Oh,
all.
no, I understand it. So, how long, so you were saying it took you quite a while to write the first one, and then to go through rewrites, and then, editing again with the publisher, and then you're on your second book. And so that journey has taken a period of time. But how, and obviously you've shared about your faith, your journey in some of this, but how has that basically helped you in life, your faith walk? I was not saved as a young person. I know lots of people who have been. I went through, a marriage and a loss of a child, and just so many things that just kind of, took me off in places that I really never expected in my life. And then I met my, current husband. We're married 30 years now, and I'm so grateful, because I say this, if I had not met him, I'm not sure. I think my life would have taken a turn that would not have been in a very good place. And, he brought me to the Lord, going to church with him, and, just that change of life and trust, and just knowing, because I never really felt, I think, that, somebody would stay. And he has stayed, even when I'm like, little, like before, I was saying before we got on, Zoom was not working. And I was like, oh my goodness, okay, so what's going on? And I'm like, and I'm losing it a little bit here. And, he is, so gracious at times, and understands, at times what you go through. But I never had that. I never really had that in my life. And I know it's very easy sometimes to take it, you forget about it, because life is different now. And sometimes you're not always sure you appreciate it as much as you should. But I'm so grateful to God that, God has done a work and continues to work. And I have a long way to go yet.
Well, congratulations on your 30-year marriage. That's outstanding.
Thank
I
you.
think we just celebrated 33.
Wow.
But my story's not too different from that. I mean, I was a Christian when Michael and I met, but I was a very young one. And yeah, if I had married someone different, then I agree. I mean, Michael has done so much to bolster my faith, and he's been my rock.
Yeah.
And way more than I deserve. It's definitely the grace of God poured down my head. And
so what would you, I love to ask this question, because I know when I first started writing, I didn't have a clue what to do. I just started, looking at all these different groups and going to a conference. My very first conference, I went up, I'm in Indiana, so I went up to Grand Rapids, Michigan, and I went to Carol Kent's conference, Speak Up. I went by myself, didn't have a clue what I was doing. Carol and Jean and everybody was so wonderful, and I made some really wonderful friends. But what advice would you give to somebody who says, you know, I think I have a story, or you know, God may be moving me to, you know, go on this journey of writing and becoming an author. Is there anything you might want to share?
Well, the first thing would be what you did intuitively, which is don't go it alone. And I meet so many writers who've been just kind of writing in a closet for years, and then they come out of the closet with this manuscript and think the world is, you know, ready to applaud it. And wow, it's no matter who you are, it does not work that way. You know, get into a critique group,
Yeah.
ideally with people who are much better writers than you are.
Mhm. Yeah.
And a good way to find a critique group is a conference, or you can join. I think of Susan May Warren's My Book Therapy. It's not a huge investment, but you'll make contacts there with people who are aspiring writers. And honestly, we need the critique. You know, we need other people to give us their opinion and their views on how well what we're writing works. But we also need the encouragement, because
Absolutely.
to your point earlier on, it is kind of a brutal business. It really is.
Um,
And you asked this question, but I'm not sure I answered it. 10 years is the answer to the two books. The two books, that has been a decade-long investment.
wow.
The first book, I think it was, you know, 6.5 years before I was signed with the publisher, and 8 years before I actually saw the book in print.
Wow.
And then the second book I probably wrote for 3 years. So it was a 10-year period with the overlap between the two. So it was a huge investment.
Sure.
And you
Sure.
have to also have a thick skin. You know, it's a little hard because your book is like your baby, and you want people to tell you that your baby is beautiful. But you also really need to be teachable. And the first time people, sorry, things keep, I don't know how to shut down all these interrupty
Yeah.
things. So I apologize for my interrupty
No
thing.
problem. You know, you were talking about critiquing. I met a really wonderful woman that I love so much. I have interviewed her 5 times, Eva Marie Everson, the
Oh yeah.
president of Word Weavers International. So I'm president of a virtual chapter here in Fort Wayne. And I have to tell you that critique and just the relationships you build have been just absolutely incredible. They have just said, like, I'm not sure this is working, or let's take a look at this. And it just helps so tremendously. And it's a safe place. You know, I really love the fact that when you get together with other people, you know what, you do have to have a thick skin, you know, because what you think is maybe wow, you know, may not be so wow, or it's, you know, but it's okay. And that's the whole thing behind it. And while I think of it, on my website, which is joemasaroministries.com, I dedicate a page of resources. So there are conferences on there, there are books, there are podcasts, there are other things on there. And I'm always there. If somebody's listening and you say, oh, that's not on there, please send me an email and I would love to add them on. So if you have any, send them my way if you get a chance to look at it. But I just love to share that kind of information because I know how invaluable it was in my life.
Another thing, story structure is incredibly important. And people have different approaches, but basically it would really behoove you to pick one to follow. So my favorites are, I actually use Susie May Warren story equation is really great for helping you nail your character arc.
Okay.
And then I use James Scott Bell has several books out on how to, so he helps you get the action in your story at the right pace. So I have this whole methodology I do where I kind of go back and forth between their two templates. And my methodology might not work for someone. Oh, and I've added kind of my own wrinkle, like, you know, picking out a theme verse for every book. And sometimes it changes as I'm writing, but it helps sort of solidify for me what is the key spiritual takeaway from this book. So yeah, you need to come up with, some people can free flow, I guess. But I think when I look at a book that's been free flowed, I often wind up saying to myself, boy, I wish that this person had implemented the 3-act structure. I'm sure it would be a lot tighter. the biggest thing is motivation. And that's a hard one because you need to be in it for ministry. You need to be in it to feed the sheep.
Yeah.
But there are so many things that pull you in the direction of, oh, I want to put myself forward. So maybe the pithiest way I can put this is the year that Plum was a finalist for the Carols and the Christie, sitting there, especially at the Christie, because at the Carols, I still was able to sort of tell myself, well, if I don't get this trophy, there's still the Christie. But then when I'm in Nashville at the Christie's and I'm walking, my category was fairly late in the program, and so I'm watching all the other people go up in their glam outfits and pick up their big lucite trophy. The Christie trophy is big. Yeah. And then get their pictures taken, and all of it just kind of feeds that in you. And I will tell you, by the time my category came up, I wanted that lucite trophy. I wanted to walk home with that lucite trophy, and I didn't, which is okay, because the only thing it should really be about is the good and faithful servant award. The Lord has given you a story. The Lord has given you an audience. The Lord has given you a message, and your faithfulness to obey him and show up and do the work of the ministry that he's given you is what matters. The acclaim that you do or don't get is not what matters. And hanging on to that and ministering to the readers, that's what we're here for. We're not here to please the judges. We're not here to collect the plaudits. We're here to minister to the readers, and hanging on to that as your motivation. Just like probably everything in life, it is a spiritual battle to hang on to that as your motivation.
Absolutely. One of the things I've learned too is, it's so easy, you can look at an author and say, oh my gosh, look at her, or look at him, and wow, look what's happening in their lives, the awards and all of these things. It's so not, it's wonderful. Don't get me wrong. I've not been there, but what I'm saying is it's wonderful if you get to that point, but it can't be about that. It strokes your ego, I guess, and it's like great to have them, believe me. But it just can't be the motivation behind why you're doing what you're doing. I so agree.
And the Lord brings the audience. A dear friend of mine is a very accomplished guitarist. And we were talking a few years ago, she did a couple DVDs, or I'm sorry, not DVDs, but CDs. She did a couple CDs, but I don't think her music ministry ever quite was as big as she probably deserved and had worked for. But she said to me, when I go in and when I minister at a church, I always just ask the Lord for one. And pretty much every time, someone would come up to me afterwards and tell me how my ministry touched them or how my ministry reached them. Mm-hmm. And if all that happened is that I reached that one, then that's enough.
Amen. Yeah, it's so true.
Unfortunately, when you're writing, you don't always see the one. Right. So you kind of have to just, your book goes out there and you just kind of have to take it by faith. But Lord, if I spent 3 years writing this book, and you only really intended it to reach the one, then that's okay. Whatever your intended, I can't measure the outcome, unfortunately, but the Lord has the measurement.
Amen. Amen.
Oh, and that's another thing. For aspiring writers, if you haven't read Alan Arnold, The Story of With, that's my other key bombshell of advice. Definitely read The Story of With. Have you read it, Joe? You're looking at me a little blank.
I have not, but I am going to now. I will definitely get that. As you know, I'm going to be down. I have surgery in a couple of days. I'm going to be down for a few months. So I've got my classes and my writing and reading that I will be doing, and that will definitely on my list to read. So thank you for that. So
His
what is,
theme
oh,
is
yeah,
that you can approach the world out of one of two mindsets. The orphan mindset is there isn't enough. I always have to be striving for more. I always have to be more. I always have to prove myself. Whereas the son or daughter of God mindset is God is enough. And as long as I'm doing this creative adventure with God, that's what matters.
oh my gosh, when we get done, I'm going to be a book, okay, because it's so, I know that my husband and I, we do ministry together lots of times, and we do a life group every week. And one of the things that we have learned to ask when people say, what can I pray for you? We're like wisdom, humility, and the walk that God has for my life, that I would continue on that path. And so those are the things that we strive each and every day to do. And do we always, do we fail? Yes, absolutely. But, that is our heart, to do that and to serve God, because we have, done it all of our lives together. And I'm so grateful for that, to have those opportunities that I never would have had in my life. So what is next for you? Like, what are you, I know you came back, you were over in England, you were at a wedding, and you were there when the Queen passed. And so what are you doing now?
Well, honestly, I'm on a bit of a hiatus at the moment. I was pretty significantly burned out after my second book. I worked really, really hard on the launch. Um, and then it turned out that we moved house. We moved from Phoenix to Prescott, which is a pretty big change in lifestyle, actually. It wasn't just moving house, it was a pretty big change in lifestyle. And that happened right on top of my book launch. And my poor husband just didn't see me, because I was at my desk 12 hours a day. And at the end of all of that, I was just like, whoa, okay, I'm not sure this is the pace that the Lord really meant me to be living at.
Yeah.
So honestly, now, like I told you, when I started writing, I thought, oh, I'll just, 2 years and I'll have a book. Now that I know what's really involved in writing a novel, I really want a very specific leading from the Lord to do the next one. So I'm playing around with a couple of story ideas. I'm probably going to shift. I have a real passion to write about Israel. So I'm probably going to shift to writing stories about Israel, maybe in this same time period, which is 1948, which is a pretty exciting time in Israel.
It is, for sure.
But I'm really waiting for the Lord to just say, okay, this is really what I want you to do.
Oh, that sounds so good. I can't wait to hear. So let me just remind people, they can connect with you on Substack at lindathompson.substack.com, and I'll make sure that we put that out there for you as well. And gosh, anything
And on
else?
Goodreads, of course.
Oh, absolutely, Goodreads. Make sure you go there. And one of the things I like to say is to make sure that you leave a review for an author. I think it's one of the greatest things that you can do. Your reviews have been wonderful. So excited for you, and so excited for the book. Again, I just loved it. I am going to be watching Shogun. I just can't wait to watch it all over again. But anything else that you want to share with our listeners before we go?
We live in such a pivotal time in history. And I think about this all the time. When I was, well, I think maybe we all sort of dream about what if I could have been one of those really blessed individuals who lived when Jesus walked the streets of Nazareth and got to see him and experience his miracles. And I've come to realize that was a pivotal and prophetic time. I think like Jesus said something to that effect about, the prophets longed to see the day that you're seeing and did not see it. But I've come to realize that the days we're living in are every bit as pivotal and prophetic. And I believe with all my heart that very soon we will see him face to face. I look at the way all the current events are rolling out, and it just all lines up so well with Bible prophecy. So that's just an encouragement to minister. If you're alive today, you are here for such a time as this. The Lord has you on the ground for a very specific purpose at this very specific time and season. So, I can't obviously tell you what that is for you. Joe was sharing with me before we started about some of the amazing ministries the Lord has put on her heart. But we need to be ministering with all our might, because the world is dying all around us. Not that that isn't always true, but it's even more true today than ever.
It so is. And I think, we get to see so much more and hear so much more with today's technology and everything. And just what is, what is happening, in Ukraine and all over the world. I mean, even in our own country, when you look at the things that are happening here, it is just, if it doesn't move you to do something, I always say, check your pulse. Okay. I always believe that God has a plan and a purpose, no matter how young or how old you are. I shared, I'm going to be 72 next week. Not a place I ever thought I would be in my life, but I want to do what God has called me to do. And sometimes I go a little, I don't necessarily want to go there, but I go because, it's him calling you to do it. And so if we could just listen, I mean, that's one of the things I think that we fail to do. It's always, I want, a blah, 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 blah. And it's not, just listen to what God, like you're doing. You're just going to wait and you're going to listen to what God wants you to do next. And so if anything.
So I have to tell you, my friend Dana Neely is a debut author with the same boutique publishing house I was with Mountain Brook Inc. And her first book, it's just a beautiful book. It's biblical historical fiction called Rain. And this one was, she also was a Carol and Christie finalist. But I wrote 2 books and kind of burned out, honestly. But she talked to me after the first book, and she's like, oh my gosh, I don't know how I'm going to do this. I don't know how I'm going to get a second book together. I don't know how I'm going to do it. All these deadlines, and oh my gosh. Well, guess what? She not only got her second book together, but she's now got a third and a fourth on the way. And she's like we were talking about earlier, she's one of these people who just always knew she wanted to be an author. And she's like, Linda, I got my dream shot. I'm right where I just always dreamed I might someday be, but never really thought I would. And she said, Linda, I published my first book when I was 70. So to your point, you're not too old.
You're not too old. No, God has a plan and a purpose. And may we walk in that each and every day. And thank you so much, my friend. I'll call you friend now because I feel like we are friends. And I look forward to connecting with you again. And please make sure you visit with Linda at lindathompson.substack.com or Goodreads. And just enjoy the journey is what I can say. And thank you so much for being with me. And I will connect with you soon.
Thank you, Joe, for your graciousness and your generosity. And we'll look forward. I'm glad we struck up this friendship, and I look forward to continuing it as well.
All right. You take care.
You too.
All right. Blessings, everybody.